Why do so many Christians simply refuse to answer a question? The moment the follow-up gets uncomfortable or the facts don't line up, instead of just saying, I don't know, they start doing a dance of evasion and lies. They make up a story, they will change the topic, they will ask a different question. They will respond with cliched sayings, insults, or threats. This behavior is what drove me out of the church entirely. Hi, welcome to the Secular Scriptures. I'm Gail, and today I'm on a rant about academic honesty and emotional maturity. I posed these questions in a deconstruction support group, and the consensus boiled down to Christians can't follow a logical chain of thought to the end because if they stop and think about it, they might lose their faith. Before I illustrate an example from Genesis, let's roll out some definitions because you know I do love me some definitions. Apologetics, the discipline of defending a particular belief or doctrine using systemic argumentation and reasoned discourse. Christian apologetics, believers should always be ready to give a defense for the hope within them. Cognitive dissonance, a psychological discomfort you feel when your behaviors, values, or beliefs clash with reality. The thought stopper or thought terminating cliche is a loaded, oversimplified phrase used to end an argument and discourage critical thinking. Example, his ways are higher. Deflection, a defense mechanism where a person shifts blame or redirects a conversation to avoid uncomfortable feelings, accountability, or criticism. Example, you just have to have faith. Not to beat a dead camel, but let's trot out our old friends, the Ishmaelites and Midianites, from the Joseph novella in Genesis. The text vacillates between saying Golden Boy Joe was sold in Egypt by one or the other group. When pointing this out as a child, I was told that the two trading parties were heading to Egypt at the same time and gambled the boy back and forth. I asked how they could both sell him to Potiphar. I was told to stop questioning God. That's an apologetic story, a threat, and a thought stopper. I recently got into this conversation with a Christian when they asked about what questions I'd had as a kid, as if I'm not a grown woman who hasn't done the reading in the decades since I was a child. And I relayed this one example expecting a more adult response, and they immediately jumped in with, they intermarried. Bam! Nice, neat package. Story over. I said, show me where it says that in the text, because it doesn't. They doubled down with some added racism for flavor. Story times two. I pointed out that Joseph and the Ishmaelites and Midianites were all direct descendants of Abraham. See chart. My interlocutor tripled down with a future state of the population. They're all Arabs! But the present does not equal the past, my friend, does it? I brought it back to evidence, please, and pointed to the timeline of the story. Not giving up without an answer here. At that point, Mr. Delightful's brain panicked and he resorted to name-calling and twisted what I'd said into a ridiculous straw man. Are you saying they never intermarried? At that point, I left the conversation with no, and I'm sure he thinks he won. I'm just not going to waste my time on absurdities. Obviously, both versions cannot literally be true, so the literalists have to make up fan fictions to reconcile the contradictions. Now, I'm never one to say no to more stories, but when asked for a reference and to apply the math and the logic to these little biblical fan fictions, or apologetics, the average Christian can't provide them because the story is not obligated to be logical or literal. That's not its function. At this point in the video, I'm going to take us on a little jaunt down logic lane. So if you just want to hear me rag on some poor Christians and don't care for math word problems, skip to the timestamp that says no more math. But especially in this discussion, I think it's important to show how we think these things through and why that reasoning is used. So, to be fair to my interlocutor, let's look at his claim that they intermarried. Okay, this is possible, but only just, and you'll see why. Let's take a look at Abraham's beautiful family tree and timeline here. The Ishmaelites are in orange. Ishmael was born to Hagar when Abraham was 86 years old. Ishmael lived for 137 years. Unfortunately, we don't know when Ishmael's 12 sons were born, before or after Abraham's funeral, but regardless, Ishmael died about 50 years before Joseph was sold into slavery. So all of his sons were between 115 and 50 years old by that time. If the family pattern of delayed parenthood held, they would be more like 70 to 50 years old. We know his daughter Basemath married Esau. They are all old enough to have children and potentially grandchildren. The Midianites, in green. The Midianites are descendants of Midian, the fourth son from Abraham's third marriage to Keturah. Abraham married Keturah when he was 137 to 140 years old. Unfortunately, we don't have a hard timeline there. And he died at 175. So all 6 of their sons had to be born in those 38 years, approximately. It implied that he gave them all gifts and sent them away as adults, so it's likely they were all born in the early part of the marriage. There are 108 years between the death of Abraham and when Joseph was sold into Egypt. There are some math issues here due to later contradictions, but it's okay, we're going to go with this one at this point in time. That means that Keturah's sons would have been between 70 and 80 years old at the time Joseph was sold into Egypt. Please note that these are not the Midianites yet. Midian is their progenitor. We don't know how long Midian lived, nor who he was married to. He could have been married to his niece, who could have been an Ishmaelite. His 5 sons, the Midianites, are listed before Joseph is born, so we can presume they are all older than 17. Considering that Midian was the 4th son, let's say he was 75 at the time little Joe was hawked for silver. If he got married around age 20, he could easily have grandkids, and they could indeed be descended from Ishmaelite women. But that's not the timing pattern we see in the rest of the story. So we have to assume that his sons were born when he was 40 to 58, putting his kids, the Midianites, between 17 and 35 years old. And that, dear friends, means that unless Mama was an Ishmaelite, the Midianites at most had babies to middle schoolers at the time Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. And that means that no, the Midianites and Ishmaelites did not have time to become the same people before that event. Now, if you want to apply real-world timelines to these characters, there is absolutely time to marry all of the nieces and cousins and have tons of grandbabies and great-grandbabies in one big, happy, inbred family. But then you suddenly have the consistency issue in the storyline where the side characters are operating under different rules from the main characters, and that's just bad world building. There is also the issue of Abraham having given all of his sons their own territory. Yes, we can say that they were neighbors. That's fine. And even if we accept that Midian may have married his niece, potentially uniting the Midianites and Ishmaelites from the get-go, though the text doesn't say that, we still have the issue of domesticated camels not happening until the 1200s BCE in Arabia, and the story is set in the 1800s. There are 2 academic explanations for the contradictions in the Joseph novella, and they largely depend on the date the text was written. The first aligns fairly well with Apologetics, which is that by the time the story was compiled in the post-exilic period, the Ishmaelites and Midianites were considered one people, and their names were used interchangeably, which we see elsewhere in the Bible. The timeline still doesn't work in literal land, but that's fine, we're in cultural history land here. The competing academic theory is that the story is much older, compiled from the fragmentary northern and southern traditions, like J&E, which is also contested, whatever, which simply disagreed about which group sold him into slavery. Either way, in the final form, the Midianites pull him from the dry well when no one else is around, and his brothers sell him to the Ishmaelites, and somehow both separately sell him to Potiphar. As with other stories in Genesis, the goal was to tell the story of their people, and sometimes those traditions had variations, and they were fine with that. This is called literature. It was changed and edited over time to suit the needs of the people, so have at it in terms of making stuff up, but the text still doesn't say that. Modern American Christians have built a fragile framework of inerrancy and literalism around the Bible, and they falsely claim that there are no contradictions. They cannot allow the text to be what it is because that does not fit their framework. They cannot allow themselves to think through the problems to the logical end because they run headlong into the contradictions, which means the Bible isn't inerrant, which means it can't be literally true, which means their religion may not be really real, and that is scary. So before that first step, before that thought is permitted to form, they have to pivot away with a distraction. Now let me ask you this. or a threat, you're going to hell, or a straw man. Anything to stop the thought that might put a crack in their faith. When I started this journey 2 years ago, I never imagined that I would be defending the Bible against modern Christians. But I truly do love these stories. As I've engaged with more Christians in online spaces, I've learned to recognize the cherry picking, the excuses, the justifications, the deflections and rationalizations for illogical, irrational, and immoral beliefs. And no, not all Christians. There are many Christians who acknowledge the issues in the text, recognize the human problems, and have developed a mature, healthy faith. But for the literalists, honesty is too costly, so they can never answer a question because it hurts too much. Thank you for joining me on the Secular Scriptures, and I will see you next Sunday at 9 a.m.